Thank you all so much for coming to see this. I expected there'd be limited interest, so I'm pleased to see so many of you. It's been a long time since I talked to a large group of students. I've been retired. This is my 6th year of retirement. So I'd like to talk a little bit today about the origins of Maria Carrillo High School. And I'm going to begin with the title, Pentimento. And pentimento is an artist's term. And it describes what happens when an artist paints a painting and then decides, no, I don't want that painting, and on the canvas they paint another one. And over time, the old images will bleed through onto the new painting. So, for instance, you might see a child make way for a dog. A large boat is no longer on an open sea. And if you look at this, you can see some of those images bleeding through. So in my first graduation speech in 1999 as principal, I used this as a metaphor to talk about looking back and thinking about 3 years as a group opening this school. And then I thought about it again when I was preparing for Saturday and the Puma Platinum celebration. So what was there 20 years ago that still bleeds through here at Carrillo today? So I've got to back up a little bit here, because I've not done this on a large screen before. So the Santa Rosa City School Board asked the community for help in naming its 2 new high schools. In 1992, they selected the name Elsie Allen High School to honor a Pomo Indian basket maker. And this is a picture of Elsie Allen. And next slide. In 1993, after narrowing the names that were submitted, they decided to name Maria Carrillo High School, and it was approved by the board by a vote of 4-1. The 2 most often mentioned names were Jack London High School and Rincon Valley High School, but then there were these others, Camino Calistoga, Los Cerros, and Los Olivas High School. Okay, next slide. But other suggestions were quite interesting. One was that they name it after Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers leader, Earl Warren, who was the governor of California and a leading legal scholar, as well as Krista McAuliffe, who died in the Challenger explosion a number of years ago. There were 2 other names, though, that were brought forward, 2 local educators. One was the superintendent at one point. His name was Mitchell Soso, and the other was Montgomery principal, who had since retired, Gary Miles. But imagine having your high school be named Soso High School, or imagine rooting and saying, "We're Miles High," and how that might be conveyed, right? So the board wisely chose not to have that as a name. Okay. All right, next slide. So Maria Carrillo at the time was one of only about 10 public high schools named after a woman. And interestingly enough, the other in the Santa Rosa City Schools, Elsie Allen High School, so 2 of the 10 were right here in Santa Rosa. And that's if you take away the names of a lot of private schools, particularly Catholic nuns and saints, etc. So it's pretty remarkable still to have 2 high schools named after women. And I was the first high school principal of Carrillo, and at the time I was the only second woman high school principal in the history of Santa Rosa City Schools. And of course you have a female principal now, Ms. Anns. All right, next slide. So you probably know a little bit about Maria Carrillo. It's in your handbook. I'm sure your teachers have probably told you about her. I think it's quite remarkable. She married when she was 16 to another 16-year-old, and then her husband died, and she was left to fend for herself and try and figure out how to support a family. And the next slide. So in 1837, she packed up her 9 unmarried children at the time. She had 13 children altogether, one of whom died young, but 12 children, and she moved north here to Northern California. And she actually resided with her daughter and son-in-law, and that was General Vallejo. And the city of Vallejo is named after him, and you can tour his home in Sonoma. And then she was granted permission for a land grant, one of the few women who were given land grants, and Carrillo actually sits on a portion of that land grant, this school. Then after she died, she was buried in Sonoma. So if you go to Sonoma to the mission there, you can actually see a plaque honoring Maria Carrillo. Next slide. So I first became really familiar with the idea of Maria Carrillo and Elsie Allen because I served on the Educational Specs Committee. And this was a committee that was helping the architects design the school and envision the school and what it would physically look like. And at the time, I represented all the English teachers in the district. There were two of us on that committee representing English, and I never thought in a million years that I would work at either of these schools, much less be an administrator at one of them. And the next slide. Maria Carrillo is often called the mother of Santa Rosa, and so this school really gets at the heart of our city and our community. So I was serving as the founding vice principal. I opened Elsie Allen High School as vice principal when I was selected to be interviewed for the principalship, and I was one of 26 applicants. And then I heard on June 13th, well, I heard shortly before that that I'd been selected principal. The next day, some friends of mine came to Elsie Allen, rented a limousine, picked me up, brought me here in the dirt field, and we had a catered Italian lunch in the dirt. And they brought champagne. Now remember, this is a work day. I'm not thinking about this much at all, and we drank champagne during the school day. And I went back to work at Elsie Allen, but it's a really wonderful memory for me. I remember the night that the board president called me and told me I was principal. I literally jumped up and down in my family room. I was so happy and so excited at the prospect. Now, I had not been a principal. This was my first and only principalship at Carrillo. Okay, the next slide. So there's only been 5 principals in the history of Maria Carrillo High School. I was the first, 3 males. And some of you probably know Mr. Van Dyke from your time here. And then, of course, Ms. Zanz is the 5th principal in a 20-year history of the school. Okay. There was a dedication and a groundbreaking prior to the school being started. I was at that groundbreaking because at that time I had been named principal, and again it was just coming out here with a bunch of dignitaries and putting the classic gold shovel in the dirt and turning over the field. And that happened in September of the year before we opened, so almost a year before the school opened. All right, and the next slide. This is what Carrillo looked like. This is the big field that existed for many years. And the next one. So originally, because Elsie Allen had wetlands, well, let me back up. So originally there were 2 designs, one for Elsie Allen, one for Maria Carrillo, that the Ed Specs Committee helped the architects work on. 2 different sets of architects. But the design for Carrillo actually ended up going to Elsie Allen, and Elsie Allen's actually ended up coming here because they discovered that Elsie Allen had wetlands, and they couldn't put temporary buildings on the wetlands at Elsie Allen High School. So if you think, those of you who have English and social science in buildings M and N, for example, those are temporary buildings. So this whole facility should have been at Elsie's, and Elsie's should have been here. And the next slide. So the school is designed literally by the architects to look like a mall in some ways. And the 2 big buildings, this building, the theater, and the gyms, are designed to mirror the big buildings that end cap malls, just like Sears and Macy's do at Santa Rosa Plaza. The next one. So this is the layout. It's all laid out. The buildings are numerically going clockwise with the A building starting and going all the way around. It's interesting, none of the buildings have big letters on them so you can tell what they are. It's really still quite confusing, I think, initially for students. Did you find that in the beginning? But if you just think about it as being alphabetical clockwise, it helps you get around. And even numbered clockwise, each building is numbered that way. Okay, the next slide. So if you look at the coloring of the building, it's quite interesting. So the dark color here at the bottom of the building is designed to mirror the ground. The lighter color is designed to mirror the hills, and the blue on the top of the metal roofs of the building is designed to mirror the sky. A beautiful little detail that most people don't know about. And the next slide. The library sits literally in the middle of the campus, and it sits there deliberately. It's designed to be symbolic and to represent that this is a place of knowledge and learning. It's highly ironic we don't have librarians anymore, but that's a whole nother discussion. Okay? So this is a picture that always makes me laugh. I would come out here, this was taken the day that after I found out I was principal, so it's kind of like this, you know, pinup girl picture for an intellectual job. My husband loves this photo, though. But I would come out here every Friday, put on my hard hat, I would go into the construction trailer, all men, and every Friday one of them would say, "Oh, we better behave because the principal is here today." And I would have to laugh politely, and then we'd have our meeting, and then we would actually walk around the school every Friday to see how construction was going. The next slide. So these were the two people that I met with regularly. This was Wayne McNamee. He was head of facilities and maintenance for the district, and I forget this gentleman's name, but he was the foreman for the construction site. And so they were my two best friends for a long time as I came out here every Friday. So here are just some photos to let you see what the school looked like when it was being constructed. The gym walls were the first things to go up, and then it was, you know, slowly being built. So this is what I got to watch every week as the school was constructed. And there's a couple of slides of these. So next one. And then the next one. So it was really an exciting project. I mean, I knew nothing about construction other than I had a grandfather and uncle who worked in construction. So I learned a lot about what they had to do and why they had to do it and when they had to do it. So it was quite an education for me as a teacher, administrator. And the next slide. So here's some more. You can really get a sense of those gym walls on these pictures. And you can see the administration building there as well. Okay, the next slide. So there was a misconception about the rocks. These are fake rocks out in the middle of the quad, if you didn't know that. The rumor in Santa Rosa was that they were heated rocks because we were known as Gucci High. That was the name that when anybody talked about Carrillo, it was, oh, you Gucci High. Oh, you're the principal of Gucci High. Because of myths like this, that there were, you know, heated rocks for kids to sit on during the school day. Okay, and the next one. So that first year that we opened, the school was not completed. We lived in a construction zone, and everywhere you looked, there was literally that bright orange fencing and police tape everywhere. We could not gather as a whole student body at any point until almost the end of the year. So the theater, the gyms, and the library didn't open until April of that year. We shouldn't have probably opened that first year. It was really difficult. So teachers are teaching in their classrooms, and you hear those backup beep, beep, beep as trucks and, you know, bulldozers are still working all around them. And the next one. This was our picture. We opened with 700 students. This was us on opening day. And you can see the landscaping wasn't even done. And we all gathered in the quad and we sang this Sam Cooke song that says, "Don't know much about history," if you know that song, a real oldie. And it was the only way we could all come together at one time was in that one spot for many, many years. And the next one. And in fact, this is how the Under the Stars dance started, because the student body wanted to have a dance, and we didn't have any facility to hold it in, so they proposed, let's have a dance out in the quad. And so I had to go to the city of Santa Rosa and get special permission to extend the noise ordinance so that we could have the dance until 10 o'clock. And that dance is alive and well still 20 years later. It's a logistical nightmare, as Mrs. Zans might attest to, trying to supervise to make sure nobody's sneaking in or sneaking out. But it was a beautiful thing, and it was a wonderful experience to finally have everybody together having a good time at school in one spot. Okay, in the year prior to Carrillo opening, I had 15 students who were selected from Rincon Valley Middle School's 8th and 9th graders, because back in the day, the junior highs were 7th, 8th, and 9th. When the 2 new high schools opened, we moved to 9-12 high schools. So this group of 15 students met with me regularly to help me envision what students wanted to see in the school. And so they actually came together and proposed color combinations. First, we had to look at every team we would ever play in any circumstance and take out their color combinations so that we didn't replicate them. So these were the choices. And of course, the winning vote was what you have now, the green, the flat gold, and the black. My favorite was navy blue, flat gold, and burgundy. And I thought when all the votes came in, nobody would know if I chose this, but I didn't. I honored the student choice. Okay, and then they also chose, next slide, they also voted on the mascot. Same thing, we had to look at every school we'd ever compete against and not have a similar mascot. These were the names that eventually went on the ballot, and this is actually the total of the ballots of the kids who voted. And so the Pumas were chosen, just a little bit over the Coyotes. At the time, one of the mascot names that was going around was Gorillas. They wanted to be the Carrillo Gorillas. And so I met with the advisory committee and said, I can't tell you not to put this on the ballot, but if you put it on the ballot, for the rest of the history of the school, the name will be mispronounced, and we will not honor Maria Carrillo, the woman after whom the school is named. So they chose not to put it on the ballot. Thank goodness. Because it would have won, for sure. Okay, the next slide. So we also had a contest to choose the winning mascot design. Doug Hoffman, who currently works as the principal investigators of materials development at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. This was his winning design on the first handbook. And the next slide, we had Matt Price choose this one. This is actually the first volume of the Puma Prensa that I'm going to give to Mr. Jowers shortly. Okay, and the journalism class chose that name for their paper. Next slide. So I also met with parents whose sons and daughters would go to school here. We had many, many meetings. The first one was in the Rincon Library, and one of the parents who's since become one of my dear friends, she raised her hand and she said, and she's a doctor and her husband's a doctor, she said, you are going to teach math and science at this school, aren't you? And I had to assure her that yes, we were, but we were also going to have a focus on the humanities. And they helped really talk about what kind of school they wanted Carrillo to be. Next slide. So they wanted a highly academic high school. And so to that end, I went to the Board of Education, this is before anybody had been hired at the school, and said, I want 2 extra graduation requirements at the school based on what parents are saying to me. One was humanities, and that exists till this day. We're the only school in Santa Rosa City Schools that has an extra requirement. At the time, you could choose to take a world language or a fine arts. I said I want students to take both, and the board approved it. And they since then have made everybody take fine arts and world language. Okay? But right from the beginning, even though parents said they wanted this highly academic high school, once grades came out, they were like, oh, we didn't mean that academic, because we had these high number of D's and F grades first quarter. And so it made the newspaper big article on the local portion of the newspaper. Everybody's up in arms. The staff meets together. We brainstorm things that we can do to try and address having kids be more successful. And then I got this idea, well, how do the other schools' students perform, 9th and 10th graders, the first quarter? And so I did a data request, and look what I found out. So we had 44%. The district average was 45%. We weren't any more challenging or hard or failing more students than any of the other 4 high schools in Santa Rosa. So that took some of the wind out of people's complaints. Okay? And the next one. So this is one of the saddest things for me. When we were meeting with the parent groups, we had lots of conversations about what kind of a parent, staff, student organization we wanted to have. And the group eventually decided we wanted one group. We didn't want to have a bunch of little parent advisory groups. And so they agreed that we would have the Marie Carrillo High School Association. And that way parents wouldn't just focus on their one interest. So if their student was an athlete, they weren't just about athletics. If their student was an artist in fine arts, they weren't just about the fine arts. And it was about serving all students. This lasted until I left, and the following year we went right back, and now we have all these different parent groups. It was a really visionary idea that I think is unfortunate it's no longer in place. All right? And then this is the mission statement of the school. I won't read it to you. You can read it yourself. I think it's still in place, if I'm not mistaken. And then these were what were called our ESLers. And I think you've just revised yours. Is that correct? After your last WASC accreditation. But this was the vision. This is what we wanted for students 20 years ago. And the next slide. So the most important job I had was hiring. It didn't matter if we had this beautiful new facility, this pristine theater, state-of-art technology. None of that mattered if I didn't hire the best teachers possible. Teachers who already taught in Santa Rosa City Schools had the right to an interview. I did not have to hire any of them. I had to interview them, and if they were the best people for the job, I chose them. And if they weren't, and some of whom were my friends, I had to say, I'm sorry you weren't selected. And it was a committee doing the selection, so it wasn't just on me. It was very awkward with some of my friendships, for sure. And one of my friends, we've been in the same book club for 32 years. I just saw her at her house last night, and she was not selected to teach here. So, but that's because the committee felt that there were stronger candidates. And this is the number of people that we hired. So lots of interviewing between here and Elsie. I love to interview and have gotten quite skilled at it as a result. All 3 administrators at Carrillo when we opened were women. Virtually unheard of, not had happened before. And people were worried about it. I remember one parent, this was kind of funny too, even with the athletic teams, he raised his hand at the meeting and he said, it's not going to say Maria Carrillo on athletic team uniforms. I was like, well, yeah, probably. It's the name of our school. He didn't like the idea of boys having a woman's name on their jersey. So, okay, the next slide. Oh, and I'll tell you my favorite, what I wanted, when Elsie Allen opened, I wanted, when we were looking at mascots, Elsie's is the Lobo. And so when we were thinking about Carrillo, I said to my husband, wouldn't it be nice if we had a name like the Artisans or something not related to an animal or, something like that. And he goes, oh yeah, Pam, that'll inspire fear in your opponents. The Artisans have entered the field, But I liked the idea at the time. When we opened, we had 3 interdisciplinary teams. We didn't have separate departments as traditional and as the school's gone back to. The district made us change this a number of years later. And the next slide. And then each of the teachers were on one of 5 school-wide teams, and they met every Monday during common planning time to think about what directions Carrillo should go. And the next slide. So we opened, as I said, with 700 students, 9th and 10th graders. I knew all of them by name. It was a wonderful thing to have a small school. And then eventually the school grew to 1,650 by adding a grade level each year. And there were 100 staff members serving them. And the next slide. This is just a picture of the first staff. And the next slide. It was interesting, the very first job I hired wasn't a teacher, it had to be an athletic director, the men's athletic director because of football. So here we are talking about a highly academic high school, and I'm going to hire an athletic director first. And very quickly, next slide, we played largely varsity teams, even though we had 9th and 10th graders. Next slide. This is one of my favorite stories, the Big Hill. It used to be this pristine green hill. I came to work one Saturday. It was going to be one of those kind of 9 a.m. to midnight days at school. I look up on the hill, and in big letters is 420. And my head custodian was there, and I said, "Oh my God, this can't be. You've got to go up there. You've got to change this." So I had them climb that hill, change it to H2O, because I could make the 4 into an H really easily, climb back down, and then I said, "Oh my God, I've just sent you onto private property to destroy it." Now remember, this was my first principalship, so I didn't think things through clearly. All right, the next one, and of course now we've got the names. This is what, our first graduation was in 1999, now you're having your 17th. The next one, this is a bad slide, looking at the school. Next one. Okay, so Maria Carrillo was ranked last year 465 out of the 500 top high schools in the United States of America. Amazing. Next slide. Carrillo's gotten California Distinguished School twice. Amazing. Next slide. And just last week, U.S. News and World Reports, out of 22,000 public high schools, Carrillo ranked 1,280 in the nation and earned a silver distinction. This is really impressive. So our dream of having a highly academic high school is alive and well. And the last slide, I think. This was in our first graduation program, out of the stream of doing into the piece of the done. So it's a school I proudly say I was a part of and retired from. So thank you all for coming, and I think Mr. Sims has some comments.
Hold on 1 minute. It is my great honor to officially induct Ms. Pam Devlin into the Alumni Hall of Fame for inspiring past, present, and